Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Or do I just sound and look like Aisha Khan? Today we are dealing with the 1956 film The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, which has this problem as a central theme. It is one of my absolute favourite science fiction films, so I'm very excited about the discussion. The film was produced by Walter Wanger, who bought the rights to the story from Jack Finney after just the first instalment was published in Collier's magazine. Don Siegel directed the film. He used to be the head of the montage department at Warner Brothers, which sounds like a really fun job. He would go on to direct quite a few Clint Eastwood films, including Dirty Harry and Escape from Alcatraz. He would also make a remake of the 1946 noir The Killers in the 60s. And David Mainwaring adapted the screenplay. Some of the other films that were big hits in the year before, in 1955, include Cinerama Holiday, The 7-Year Itch, and Guys and Dolls. Some other famous films from 1955 were To Catch a Thief and Rebel Without a Cause. I'm going to list off a few of the science fiction films from 1955, which include It Came from Beneath the Sea, The Quatermass Experiment, This Island Earth, and Revenge of the Creature. And now on to my wonderful guests. Barry Keith Grant is Professor Emeritus of Film Studies from Brock University, Canada. He has written/edited a ridiculous number of books on various film studies topics, including the BFI Classics book on Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Welcome to the show, Barry. How are you doing today?
Fine, thank you.
Sherryl Vint is Professor of Science Fiction Media Studies at the University of California, Riverside. She has written/edited extensively about science fiction. Welcome to the show, Sherryl. How are you doing?
Wonderful, and thanks for having me.
Great. I wanted to start off by discussing the origins of the story and the fact that Wanger bought this after just one episode had been released. Barry, can we go to you to talk about the difference in vision that Wanger and the author Finney had?
Well, I think Walter Wanger, I think his name is pronounced Wanger, by the way.
Oh, Wanger, I've been
I
pronouncing it
think.
wrong.
Anyway, he obviously saw something in this story that appealed to him because he purchased it so quickly. It wasn't even finished yet. So it was released in 3 installments in Collier's magazine, which was a weekly magazine, and it appeared in over 3 successive issues in November and December 1954. But very quickly, before even the 3rd installment was out, Wanger had purchased the rights to the film, and with Daniel Mainwaring was meeting with Jack Finney. I think Jack Finney was a very visual writer. There are things in the book that would appeal to a filmmaker immediately, such as that scene on the pool table with the body on the pool table, with when you have that light swinging overhead, which is a really nice visual
Very nice
moment. But that's described in the novel, actually. And a lot of the dialogue is taken right from the novel. But Finney had a somewhat different vision than Wanger, because I think Wanger was much more politically conscious, and he was a liberal, and his films often dealt with liberal attitudes. But Finney, I think, was very much of a guy who just liked tradition and liked the old ways of doing things. And there's a lot of a sense of nostalgia in the novel. Some of it we could talk about. Some of it comes across in the film, and it seems to characterize virtually almost all of his writing.
It's so beautifully nostalgic. There's one extract I've taken where he talks about the women on the phone line, because they've got dial phones now and you don't have to talk to an operator. And it was so beautiful and very, very nostalgic. And it's so strange because I've never had to do that. And it's something that I don't, that doesn't affect me. But at the same time, I was thinking in modern life with AI and stuff, we do worry about these things to this day. So it is an ongoing theme, even though it's not specific. What's your experience of his nostalgia, Sherryl?
Well, I mean, I think that that's one of the things I find really interesting about this film, the sense that the threat of aliens is also sort of a threat of the rural becoming the urban, of the small town becoming the anonymity of the city. And I think that that comes out very clearly in the opening of the film.
Mhm.
And I think, as you're saying, regarding questions of AI and whether or not we can rely on our media infrastructures, that nicely comes up when the operator tells him that all the circuits to Los Angeles are dead and all the ones to Sacramento are busy. And interesting, he tries Los Angeles before he tries Sacramento too, I suppose, is given that Sacramento is the capital.
It's the capital, yeah.
But I think one of my interests in this film is the number of times it's been adapted and how the adaptations so readily speak to new historical contexts. And in sort of rewatching some of the adaptations to prepare for this podcast, that got me thinking precisely about AI, and that now we can have imitations of a person, or we can have a person speaking languages they don't speak, or various other things with AI assistance. So it seems like perhaps we're due for
Headed for a remake.
another
Yeah.
adaptation for our current moment. Yes, precisely.
Speaking of duplication, it's interesting that and AI. It's interesting that 1955, when this film was in production, is the first year that videotape was introduced. So the
Ah,
technology is already kind of moving towards duplication and
Mm,
confusing the original from the duplicate.
yeah, that's
very
very, very
interesting.
interesting, and particularly because television production is moving to recording instead of just broadcasting live performances. So all these things about mediation, that's an interesting point.
Hmm.
Absolutely. And so I wanted to go on to a film that came out a few years earlier, which has a very, very similar theme, which is Invaders from Mars. And Barry, you mentioned in your book, I've watched the film, and the reason I haven't covered it, because I did quite enjoy it, is because I knew that I would definitely be covering this book.
Hmm.
But you'd suggested that it resonates a little bit more with you, or it did when you were younger. So can you tell us a bit about your experiences of watching both these films when you were a child?
Yeah. I think Invaders from Mars really affected me more on a personal level because the protagonist is a young boy. And when I first saw it, we were, I guess, roughly the same age. So it was much easier for me to identify with Jimmy Hunt than it is for me to identify with Kevin McCarthy, who, was a much older person than I was. That story to me is more frightening because it's really about the loss of childhood innocence in some ways, because all of the authority figures that boy knows becomes taken over by the aliens, and they become kind of emotionless, as in Invasion of the Body Snatchers. But serially, his parents are taken over, his teacher, the police chief, anybody that a young child would turn to in
Mm,
fear. And the other thing that strikes me about that film, which is very different from Invasion of the Body Snatchers, is the look of that film. Invaders from Mars was
yes.
designed and directed by William Cameron Menzies. And Menzies, uh, as you probably know, the term production designer was created for him in Gone with the Wind. Um, and he also, as you will know, designed and directed Things to Come in 1936, which is a stupendous looking film. Um, but this film has a kind of surrealist minimalism about it. But just the look of the places in that film, like the police station, which has nothing in it, it's so bare. Uh, you would never mistake it for a real police station, but it's like a police station of the mind, almost. And uh,
Interesting.
and so I found, that film really grabbed me on a personal level. Invasion, but I did not see that film when it first came out. I saw it on television a few years later because it's 3 years before Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Mm.
Although I did, stumble in unawares to Invasion of the Body Snatchers when it was showing, because I went to the movies every weekend. That's what we did. And there was, of course, no uh, rating system operating at the time.
Yeah.
I mean, that didn't even happen till after those infamous screenings of Night of the Living Dead. That was much later. And I don't recall my parents ever saying, "Well, maybe that's too frightening. You shouldn't go." It was, to them and to everybody, pretty well, it was just movies, and that's what you did.
And also, it's quite interesting because you say that you could relate more to the child in Invaders from Mars,
Right.
but it's exactly the same experience for an adult, because it's so frustrating because you really want people to be believed. But there's no way you'd believe someone who's telling you the story in real life, Like, it's so understandable and real. Like, if someone was like, "Oh yeah, my mother's turned into like a pod person," you'd be like, "Okay, we need to get you help." It's such a clever kind of premise to the whole thing.
Well, Dr. Bassett says at the end of the film, after Miles finishes his story, before the injured truck driver is brought in, Dr. Bassett, played by Richard Deacon, says, "Mad as a March hare." That's his diagnosis.
Yeah. And we all thank God that truck driver had an accident. And I think you suggest in your book that it's divine intervention that it happened, because there's no way otherwise it would work.
Well, I asked the question.
Cheryl, can we... Yeah. Cheryl, can we talk a little bit about the genre of this film? Because there's a long history, I think, not long history, it's not been that long, we're 56, but in the 50s, there's a huge crossover. And in the 30s as well, between science fiction and horror. And this film also then edges into noir.
Sure. And I think one of the things that's important to think about here as well is that, while there's a relationship between them, print genre and film genre don't always map entirely. So the print science fiction genre is really emphasizing quite different things at the time. Although alien invasion is among the things, but the print tradition is much more interested in policing these kinds of genre boundaries and being really clear what is scientific extrapolation and what is not, or at least claiming to be really clear about that, because a lot of what passed as scientific extrapolation doesn't seem that scientific.
And also with this, I was just thinking with noir, like I don't know if you could do a book that kind of leaned so heavily into the noir aspects.
If you could, well, I mean, I think the noir aspects, the sort of sense of determinism, ways in which certain choices make you fated to certain outcomes, particularly if the sort of frame that makes it a happy ending was removed, I think that would lead much more to a noir kind of reading of the film. And then I think some of the I guess we could call them sexual politics, the Miles and Becky both being divorcees, and the quickly rekindling their sexual relationship in a scandalous way. Although when I teach this film, my students have trouble recognizing that they've rekindled their sexual relationship.
Good morning.
Good morning. Orange juice.
Thank you.
How'd you like your eggs?
Oh, any way you like.
Boiled, 2 minutes.
2 minutes?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. You know, dragging you out of bed in the middle of the night was a lot of trouble, but it was worth it.
Now, seriously.
And you see this repeated in the later films, too, that when the female characters succumb and are turned, they suddenly turn extremely seductive and very femme fatale kind of vibes. So I think some of the gender politics of film noir are very visible in this film.
And so can we just quickly mention the framing device, which was added in afterwards, after they finished shooting, which is, so Miles is telling the story rather than just beginning. And then at the end, he's again, he's gone into the streets. He's done that fantastic scene. I just love the audio from it when he's like running into the streets and trying to warn everyone. And then they have him, in the doctor's office. So can we talk a bit about the framing device and what purpose it has?
It was added after the film had finished shooting, at the insistence of executives at Allied Artists, because they thought it was too downbeat, an ending without it. and audiences would be confused because there was no resolution. So they were just uncomfortable with it. Don Siegel, the director, did not want to do it because it also involved putting the voiceover in as well.
Yeah, that
and-
that I was aware of, but I was thinking it had to be because I was like, it wasn't a test audience. They didn't have test audiences, so who did this? So it was the
Actually,
Allied studio.
there were three preview screenings of the film, and I think it was the third one that audiences just responded negatively to the ending.
It's interesting because it again adds to the noir kind of feel of the film.
Well,
like you've got the
does.
lighting and you've got the police, and then it makes it extra noir.
Yeah, you get the voiceover in retrospect, so it becomes like many film noirs. And I mean, we could compare it to, in a way, to Sunset Boulevard or DOA, because Sunset Boulevard is narrated by somebody who's already dead. DOA is narrated by somebody who's about to die. There's a sense of fatedness, of fate with the retrospective narration. So Siegel did not want to do it, but he ended up doing it because basically he was told, if you don't, we'll get a janitor to do it. So it'll get done. So you might as well do it. So he did it. But my view of that frame tale is, first, it changes the relationship of the viewer to the film, because now it's kind of it's in recollection as opposed to happening now. So the viewer doesn't discover the horrific situation along with Miles. We kind of know in advance, and he says at the beginning that evil had taken over the town. It was changed, but I couldn't see it when he was coming home. So the viewer's already primed. But my view is that Siegel had the last laugh, because I think that the ending is far more ambiguous than it at first seems. So it's almost like a pod person. It has a surface veneer, but there's more going on underneath it. For one thing, how could they possibly stop this invasion now? When Miles is on the highway in that penultimate scene you're talking about a minute ago, he goes past that truck filled with pods, and it's going past San Francisco, Los Angeles, Portland, Seattle. How could
and
they?
You don't know how many
possibly,
towns these pods are in.
We saw with the earlier distribution to all the local towns where people put the pods in their little trunk, they were calling out multiple town names.
Already, yeah. No, we don't know how far it's spread. And Miles says it's spread like a malignant disease across the country. And of course, the other thing is that we don't know anything about the two doctors and the two policemen who were there. We already know that policemen and doctors and another psychiatrist, Danny Kaufman, have become pod people. So there's no reason to trust these people. And Miles doesn't at the beginning. He looks at Dr. Hill, the psychiatrist, and he says, "Who are you?" It's as much a kind of metaphysical question as anything else. And at the end, Dr. Hill says to the two policemen who've never said a word and are standing there in unison, put out an all points alarm and, call the FBI, do this, do that. And they leave together silently. They don't even say yes, sir, or anything. They just leave the room.
It's actually really interesting to me, and it's quite a theme in science fiction, is, and this is in the book as well, that nobody trusts the police. Like, we don't trust authority figures in science fiction. It's always like, don't call the police.
Would you be able to forget that you're a doctor for a while?
Why?
I don't want you to call the police right away.
Quit acting like a writer. What's going on?
Maybe you can tell me. You're the doctor.
And I find that really interesting. Like, it's an ongoing theme that the first thing like, if you see something, like you see a body in your house, surely you're going to be like, okay, I'll call the police. But they're like, no, we cannot call the police if there's a body in the house. It's very interesting.
Well, I mean, I think it depends which science fiction you're reading, because some of it has a tremendous trust in military authority, if not the civilian police. I wish the frame wasn't there, because I think the ending of
Yeah.
implicating the viewer in the difficulty is really effective, and it sort of evokes a different set of themes, not about sort of how we non-pod people can stop the pod people, but about the sort of uncertainty about who is or who is not a pod person. And part of what really interests me in that ending is that no one helps him. So supposedly he made it to the highway. These are not pod people. These are just normal Americans going about their business. And a man is screaming and asking for help, and they're trying to avoid hitting him, but otherwise going automatically about their day, which is sort of the quintessence of the pod people. And then that a similar kind of theme or scene rather recurs in all the adaptations afterwards, emphasizing that, I think.
There's also a passage in the book which suggests something along the lines of they look through some old newspapers and they see all the kind of terrible things that are happening in society, like corruption and murder and everything. And it's comforting to them that it's like, oh, the normal bad things that happen rather than this kind of invasion of soulless kind of creatures. So yeah, it's similar that where does that line get drawn? But let's talk about this. I think it's such a terrifying concept, the pods, the threat of it, and also the fact that, I mean, when I get sleepy, nothing can stop me. And so it's such an impending doom. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think making it sleep, that when you fall asleep, that they can get you. One way to think about that is sort of emerging psychoanalytic concepts, and like awakeness is reason, and sort of irrationality, emotion is when you're asleep. So these are the things that make us vulnerable. So I think that some of those binaries that are really important to Western ways of thinking are being reinforced in that way. But I also think it's universalizing. Everyone falls asleep. And as you say, we actually, no matter how strong you are, or how many drugs you take, or whatever else you do, eventually you do fall asleep. Unfortunately, it's always the women who give in first, but in the gender dynamics of the film. But that's, I guess, understandable for the time in which the book was written and the first adaptation.
Yeah, all
was
women
made.
were sleeping all the time in the 1950s,
Exactly. They had what else did they have to do? But I mean, I think, and then sleep is when we're vulnerable, right? Sleep is often like in horror, people, creep up on you in your bed, or monsters come out from under your bed. Sleep is when we can't be vigilant.
It's interesting because it was about to be called Sleep No More.
That's right.
Which is, from the Shakespeare speech. And Barry, you suggested that there was a Shakespeare theme running through this film.
Well, I think that there are moments that refer to Shakespeare. So, like when Miles is looking at the X-ray of the skull, and it's a kind of his last poor Yorick speech. Becky and Miles both make references to Shakespeare before they go out to the Skyline restaurant for dinner. Where they're talking about, I forget the exact dialogue, but they're talking about the Sylvan Woods and This Way Lies Madness. I don't recall that dialogue being in the novel, so that might be Daniel Manwaring's edition.
Interesting. I just wanted to talk briefly about the names, the town names in the 1956 version. So Santa Mira, Barry, you were saying that that's like a slight it kind of points towards a theme of the film.
Yeah, well, as we were saying, there's no actual town in California named Santa Mira, although it sounds like it could be. But
there's Santa a lot of other things.
Right. And mira in Spanish is a command to look. So it goes with that Miles's warning. It's the same kind of thematic. You're next. Pay attention. Give heed. I think one of the towns that the pods are being taken to is Milltown, which was the brand name of the first mass market tranquilizer in the U.S. Which would have been
launched just a year before. Yeah,
year before. So the idea of this medicated community is like the town of Santa Mira, when everybody is just kind of walking around passively.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to point a quote by Danny Peary, who says, regarding the town, a town where the Spanish must have pushed out the Native American population and subsequently the English-speaking Americans must have pushed out the Spanish. The pod people are just one more in a long line of invaders who are bent on wiping out the previous culture, which I thought was quite interesting. Let's go on to the various readings and politics of the film. Barry, you go first, and we'll move over to Cheryl.
To me, what's interesting about the way we can interpret this film and the way it has been interpreted is that we can read it in two almost diametrically opposite ways, as a critique of domestic culture and kind of creeping conformism, which was thematically something that was discussed a lot in the 1950s. And in fact, I think the same year as Invasion of the Body Snatchers is The Man in the Gray Flannel Suit, which about the kind of dullness of identity for an advertising executive. Right? And at the same time, we have Vance Packard's book, The Hidden Persuaders, about advertising and the way advertising is, I don't think he uses this word, but brainwashing consumers.
I think people had a fear that the independence of, an individual in the USA was being corroded by capitalism and corporate culture, right?
Yeah. Well, there was that book by, which was a very popular book by William White called The Organization Man. But his argument was that they were now more motivated by a kind of groupthink, trying to advance within corporate culture. So doing the right thing, not rocking the boat, as opposed to being, as David Reisman would say, being inner directed and pursuing one's own values. So we have this, and the scene where the townspeople are chasing Miles and Becky out of town with the horn, the siren blaring in the background. Is a really horrific image of, I think, McCarthyism, of the group hounding and pursuing the individual, and then they go in the tunnel and they go under those planks, and it's like the herd is running right over them. You couldn't ask for a better visual metaphor than that.
Flattening them.
But at the same time, there's also that very popular trope in 50s culture of the fear of communism, and communists as kind of unthinking, unindividualized people, because they're thinking in terms of the society and not as individuals. And in that sense, that image of Grimaldi's stand, Miles said, the fruit stand, and Miles says, I should have clued in right away, he says, when he saw that stand was closed, because it was the busiest one on the road. And Mrs. Grimaldi says, too much work. So they've not just lost their emotions, they've lost their capitalist drive, their ambition, anything that's going to get them ahead and motivated in capitalist society.
Yeah, so it's really interesting because it can go either way in that regard. You can have, it literally can fit absolutely any side of the spectrum in terms of politics, because you have, these emotionless communists coming after you, or you have these emotional capitalists coming after you. And it's so, I love the fact that it does that it can be either or.
And if I could just jump in, that I think you make a good point in the sense that, those infected by the aliens claim to not have emotion, and the sort of pretense that you can act without emotion and then you can pass, which we see come up again that comes up in zombie films later on, things like that. But in fact, as you point out, they have a lot of emotions when they're trying to hunt down anyone who doesn't conform to what
Yeah.
they're doing. And so there's a degree to which, the film, you can read it both ways. And I think that's part of why it's been such an enduring text that gets adapted to new times and new situations. It's one of the reasons I really like it. But I think it also, it gets back to that centrality of the pod people, why this became a term that, at least when I was young, was very common in popular culture, even for people who had never seen
Same.
this film and didn't understand that this was the source of that term, pod
Mhm.
people. Because there is a way that when our ideologies diverge, we start to assume or accuse the others of not thinking, being automatic, not having the right kind of affect regarding issues that we feel are the ones you should have affect about, having the wrong affect about issues that maybe shouldn't be so important to you. And so I think the sort of doubleness by which you can read the film really gets at how this sense of being politically or ideologically alienated from others who suddenly seem like they're not really fully human to you anymore, or certainly they're not the humans you thought they were, that occurs on both sides or all sides of the political spectrum, but activated by different kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also, obviously every film has its own context in terms of era, but 1956, you've got Rebel Without a Cause, which came out the year before. I mean, The Wild Ones has come out, and you've got the Beat Generations out there. And I just think it must have been such like most of these films, quiet town America, but something's beneath the surface. Like the 60s are about to hit in quite a kind of an amazing way, like culturally, but that's not apparent yet. Sherryl, let's go back to you to talk a little bit about the gender dynamics. And I know that Barry has some interesting things to say about this too, but let's go to you first.
Right from the moment that Becky comes on the screen, she clearly doesn't fit into the small town aesthetic. And especially that first costume design where she kind of has like froth coming out of her bosoms, very clearly associates her with the froth later of the pod people. And so, she's the small town girl who got away, and instead of like getting married and staying as a doctor's wife and being a wholesome part of the community, she went off and did whatever it was that she did. And then she comes back as a divorcee. She got her divorce in Reno, so I presume that's somehow more scandalous than a normal divorce you could get in reasonable time. So I think it's not extremely overt, but there's always these hints that there's a kind of sexual promiscuity that's associated with Becky, that she and Miles kind of, quickly fall into being almost a couple. And there's several jokes about like dark hallways and whether or not Miles has something else in mind at breakfast the next morning, but then their neighbors are also at breakfast. So they, it's always hinted at, but never acted upon. In the 1978 adaptation, something that really leaps out to me in that film is when Dr. Kibner is trying to convince a wife, like, oh, it's all in your mind. And he says, well, any number of things could explain why he's behaving differently. He lists off several, one of which is, he might be queer. And so there's a way that kind of McCarthyist policing of what kind of identities are allowed, I think, is very much there in the accusation of who's a pod person. So I think, as you just said about some of these things that are nascent in 1950s culture that are going to explode more visibly into popular culture in the 1960s, there are people refusing traditional gender roles, wanting to come out as queer, wanting to have different kinds of family relationships. Remember, women are only recently forced out of the workplace by the return of men from war, and so women were no longer required in these industries. Various kinds of post-war ways of supporting returning military veterans really emphasize the domestic nuclear family as the sort of central organizing metric of public life. And I think that also ties in the small town setting, in the sense that, what the suburbs are meant to imitate in some ways is the small town setting where you're confined to the family home or kind of family socializing with your neighbors, as opposed to people living in big cities, in dense inner city communities where women could have other kinds of like social lives outside of domestic partnerships, but the suburbs don't really facilitate that. This is also a period where suburban growth is happening. So I think all of the anxieties that are attached to pod people are also attached to challenges to traditional gender dynamics.
They obviously make all these suggestions because the Hays Code is intact during this time. So, these things are scandalous in the 50s for your average person. And it's kind of funny because I think in the book it's far easier to be, for Miles in the book, he's far more like, oh no, I'm gonna end up married, this is terrible. But in the film they don't have to deal with that. But the fact that they're divorced is an issue that went back and forth with the censors, right, Barry?
That's correct. The Hayes office, I think it was Joseph Sherlock in charge at the time, was not happy with the fact that the two protagonists are both divorced, and there was memos going back and forth with Walter Wanger. Why can't you write that out and put his wife died, basically.
Dead women are always preferable to divorced ones.
Because it's not really central to the story, but it's absolutely central to the story. And I think Wanger did the right thing. He just kept ignoring them, basically, and just went about doing what he did. The Miles of the novel is much more pronounced. Like, I would say he's actually a misogynist. He really makes some nasty comments about women, but it's all his own fear of them. I mean, that becomes clear as the book goes on, which is why I like that moment in Jack's den where we have the femme fatale sign poster right behind where Becky's standing. Another way to read the pods is as a projection of masculine fear of women. Miles, he's been burned once. He doesn't want to be burned again, although he takes to Becky pretty quickly in the film. But the other thing that you mentioned, Cheryl, which I think is right on, is the fact that her incredible strapless dress has that white frilly.
Nobody stands a chance against that dress. I'm sorry.
No. It will take you over.
Like those pods frothing away.
It's really a visual rhyme with the pod when it pops open. So it really associates the two of them. And this all comes to a head when Miles kisses Becky in the tunnel. The tunnel itself we could take as a kind of fear of femininity, but those two reaction shots of the two of them, Miles has abject mud dripping down his nose and his face. He's been soiled now, and the whole thing is organized as a masculine fear of the woman. And as he runs out, and he had kissed her earlier before they go to the restaurant. He says, that's how I know you're Becky Driscoll. So he defines her by her sexuality. And when he's running after that, and when I showed this in class, students always laughed at this moment. He said, and the voiceover.
The greatest fear he can imagine.
He says, I didn't know the meaning of fear until I kissed Becky. And then I ran like little Jimmy Grimaldi. So it's almost like he's kind of metaphorically castrated in a way. He's been reduced to childhood because his sexuality hasn't conquered the woman, right? She was indifferent.
Yeah.
How masculine a viewpoint this is, because of what Don Siegel said about this scene. He says, I've kissed many pods in my life. So it's, even as he's saying this, it's a projection of his own perhaps inadequacy as a kisser, because a woman's not responding.
It's not something I think any I can't imagine Don wants to admit what he just kind of tells the world when he says this, but I completely agree with you.
And in many ways, this is the climax of the film, much more than the scene on the highway. This is clearly not a reading the film invites, but one of the things I personally, as a female viewer of the film, really enjoy about that scene in the two reaction shots is that previously we've seen a lot of like whinging on about love and how love and beauty are the things that are being taken away, and without love, what is the meaning of the world? And we've seen Becky be quite sort of weak and clingy and dependent and like, Miles, I want to love and be loved and things like that. When she first wakes up and she's still trying to convert him, she gives him a very seductive look in a close up. But in the reaction shot after he has this like realization and they kiss, she looks on him like very coldly, and
condescending almost,
which is of course the sort of the inhumanity of the pod people, but also sort of suggests that maybe there's some other things in life other than loving and being loved, which is not a bad point from my point of view. And so I think that there's sort of some against the grain pleasure to be had in thinking about that scene as well.
Yeah, you're like, maybe I should be a pod person.
Yeah, it's like...
Interesting. Thank you for that, Cheryl. Yeah, okay. So there's so many remakes, and as we've discussed already, we think another one is due with all this AI. But so many remakes. Let's go to the 1978 one because that is often considered the best. Cheryl, you go ahead.
What can I say about this film? I do love this film. In many ways, I probably like the 1956 one the best, but I really of the adaptations, I like the 1978 one the most. And in part, it's what I always like about any adaptations, that it resituates it to a new context, both physically and temporally, and then engages with sort of a different set of questions that are occurring to people at that particular moment. So I like how the fears of the pod people are much more widely articulated to a number of people who don't believe the story. So there's in the 1956 version, there's not this sense that, oh, if only people had listened, we could have prevented this, right? In fact, he, in his voiceover, continually says he didn't really see the clues soon enough. And so it's only once he's gone through this experience, there's this possibility of stopping the pod people. Whereas we see multiple people whose perspective is marginalized and devalued, usually women saying something about their husbands that could have warned people that something was going wrong at an earlier point if only they were listened to. But instead we have this great psychiatrist guru enforcing a really sort of like consumerist brand of psychiatry, I would say, because he's known as like this sort of rock star of selling all these books. He's having this very fancy lunch party. So this is not a countercultural speaker. This is someone who's speaking to the sort of corporate turn of counterculture, who's the kind of main voice of delegitimizing the people who are raising concerns, and then later on becomes one of the people trying to forcibly convert them. So I find that really interesting. I think it speaks to not only a kind of rising corporate turn that we're going to see sort of fully flower with the Reagan era of his presidency, not his governorship. So it's already starting to bud, I guess we can say, with his governorship. But also, to the counterculture seeming to turn dark.
It's a far more cynical time.
It's a far more cynical time. Yeah. The Jonestown massacre happens, and although it doesn't happen in San Francisco, they were in San Francisco before they went to their compound. So there's a sense that these all these flower child alternative lifestyle things are turning dark. So the film like reinforces a kind of conservatism we see in the 1956 version of not wanting to move in that direction in the first place, and this is in some ways a reaction against the excesses, we might say. So I think that's interesting, and I also think the woman is made less dependent on the man and less the vector of contagion, although ultimately she still proves to be that. We have to wait to the 2007 version where the man becomes the vector of contagion for the woman. So. But I mean, again, as you say, it's a far more cynical time, and we're having, other films at that time, a kind of post-Watergate sensibility, I guess one could say, a sense of the surveillance state, films like The Conversation. But the ending, we're very much set up to expect a happy ending and that he's faking conformity. And then we have this very Orwellian ending where he does love Big Brother after all. So I take delight in that ending.
I find the two that they changed the location, so it's gone from small town America to just like a huge city. So that's quite interesting as well.
This is not the San Francisco. This is not what we think of San Francisco now, right? Where we think San Francisco, Silicon Valley, and then San Francisco has also sort of recently become the poster child for like either the crisis of wokeism that produces whatever that it's supposed to produce, or the crisis of gentrification and homelessness. But this is a sort of coming out of San Francisco as this home of the counterculture, because I think younger people are going to have very different associations with San Francisco than the ones.
Yeah, when woke meant something different, which is quite relevant to the pod people
well, that's
situation.
True. Yeah, in fact, I'm a little hesitant to go too far down this pathway, but definitely rewatching the films in preparation for the podcast made me feel the time is so ripe for another adaptation, because wokeness or an anti-wokeness have become such charged terms in public debate.
Absolutely.
Philip Kaufman, the director, said that, and this just basically endorses what Cheryl's been saying, has said that this is not a remake. He thought of it as a sequel. So that, San Francisco now is a big city, but it's also one of the locations where the pods were being taken to in the original.
I just wanted to quickly pop in that I think it's interesting in the 78 version, the whole mystery behind, because there's a huge plot hole in the first one where at the end Becky goes to sleep and she wakes up and she's fully clothed and she's she's a pod person. But it's such a good film, so we allow it to happen. Whereas they're able to deal with the pod and the naked woman and everything in 1978.
Yeah. The one touch that I really, two, I guess, that I really like about this film is, one, the botched pod attempt with the dog and the human face.
Yeah,
that's
don't know what's
bizarre and unexpected. It's such a strange thing. I absolutely loved it.
I feel the threat of a dog getting run over provoking emotion would have sufficed. I didn't really feel like the effect was necessary.
And now I've totally forgot the other one.
Sorry.
Yeah. And then the other thing that I really like about the 78 version and the other sequels is that it much more brings to the fore this idea that there might be some benefit to the changes that the pod people are bringing.
They really, yeah.
Because there's a sense, they sort of say it'll be better in the 56 version, and it seems to be that kind of equilibrium notion of better, right? You won't get upset, so everything will be calm, and like a lack of emotion leads to a sort of stability that will be better. But they offer some reasons why human emotions are quite destructive in the 1978 version, and a stronger rationale for why it is that perhaps people might choose to be converted to the pod people. So I find it interesting that motif grows with the adaptations, because it's even more strongly there in the 2007 version.
Right. It's all the trouble spots at the time have kind of resolved themselves.
Yeah, it's like, peace in the Middle East, and
they go through a list of
bombings in Iraq have dropped. The U.S. is going to offer universal health care. I had a particular chuckle at that one. The Darfur ceasefire is going to happen. And then when the film ends and everything's back to normal, so unlike Becky and Elizabeth, who have to die, the love interest male figure in the 2007 version, she only shoots him in the leg, and then they're able to actually reverse the pod process through genetic engineering so he can live and survive at the end. And he's like reading a newspaper, and it's sort of like, oh, wars are breaking out everywhere, and people are getting fired, and there's strife. So we're human again. Interestingly, if we think of the first film being connected to a kind of anti-McCarthyist scare, there's this like people from the Czech Republic, because there is no Czechoslovakia anymore, but people who remember Czechoslovakia, speaking with the Russian ambassador where they have dinner, and sort of joking with him about how useless Russian ideology is, because of course America's won the Cold War and everything's going to be perfect now that we have like capitalism, otherwise known as democracy, ruling the day. He says something like, well, when we don't have any of these problems, then we'll know we're no longer human. And that's evoked again at the end. And so I think that this is where, again, this sort of more subtle but still present critique of the damage done by capitalism comes out even in that film, which is much more ambiguous in the end. That the domestic family is extremely happy, and they've even like adopted an extra child who lost its parents to being pod people. But the world seems worse off, even as the domestic family seems better off. Whereas the 1956 film suggests that those two can't be separated, right? That as soon as the domestic family falls apart, everything else will fall apart too. So I find that trajectory very, very interesting.
Can I mention something about the Abel Ferrara version, which we didn't really talk about?
Yeah.
The military-based one. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Please do.
When I first saw this film, I thought the metaphor of the military.
So this is the 1993 version, right?
Right. Yeah. The metaphor of the military was too easy. But I think I liked it better rewatching it last week. And I thought the ending really captured the ambiguity that I was arguing was in the original one, where you get the shot of the soldier bringing in the helicopter, and he's got these sunglasses on. The camera comes down so that he's silhouetted against the sky, and then he's motionless. So we have no idea if this base has been taken over and this guy's a pod, or if he isn't, he might as well be. So, I like that ambiguity.
I was trying to figure out who is the voice at the end.
Where are you gonna go? Where are you gonna run? Where are you gonna hide? Nowhere. 'Cause there's no one like you left.
Is that the soldier, or is this a voice that the alien is speaking? I was trying to figure that out.
I don't know if I would take that literally within the diegesis, but it's like the film speaking to the viewer and leaving us with a note of paranoia.
Oh, like the your next shot.
Yeah.
I see.
Okay, can we go to some recommendations for the listeners that they can pair with the film or films?
All right, so I have two, and one is another text that's been through multiple iterations, and initially it has its initial film adaptation is roughly contemporary. So it's John W. Campbell's novella Who Goes There, which was made first into The Thing from Another World, and then into The Thing, and then it also had like a 2012 adaptation that I think was also just called The Thing. But it also very much is about sort of alien life, invasion, transformation, and then in some of the iterations raises questions about whether or not it's better or not better to be transformed. So I think that it's another text that's been adapted multiple times because of its ability to be resituated to speak to new contexts. And then this other one is maybe a little more bizarre, but this whole question of, in the 78 version where we start out with the spores floating through space, we get much more clearly the story, like they came from a dying world and they came to sort of make a new life elsewhere. So I wanted to recommend The Man Who Fell to Earth, both the original film and then the later TV series adaptation of it, which came out only a couple of years ago, that also offer this kind of question of colonialism and its legacies and how tales of alien invasion speak to that.
Thank you so much. Barry, your recommendations, please.
I would recommend Invaders from Mars, which we've talked about before, which was also remade. I don't really like the remake very much, but the original from 1953 to me is another classic of paranoia of the era. And my other recommendation is Robert Heinlein's The Puppet Masters. It seems to me it's got a kind of similar premise. And it's been years since I read it, but I remember it being quite frightening.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, guys, for coming on. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me.
Our pleasure.
Great. That's it for this episode. Next episode, we'll be talking about Forbidden Planet, which is a favourite of many of you out there, I believe. Check the show notes on where you can watch that. A heads up that I should be introducing adverts to the podcast in 2025. Apologies, but I really want to try and spend more time on the podcast and less time on other freelance work if possible. If you have time and you can leave a rating or a review for the show, it's always really appreciated. And that's enough from me. Bye-bye.